Good evening. Hiya. Welcome to the Arboriculture Association Wednesday webinar, sponsored by Still. And this is the last one of the current series. Boo. My name is John Parker. I'm CEO at the association. Please do say hello in the chat. Select everyone and use the Q&A button for questions, and we'll work through as many as we can at the end. Round about now, at this point, I normally tell you about the next webinar we've got coming up, but as I've just said, there isn't going to be one. So instead, I will just take the opportunity to quickly say thank you to all of our speakers over the last couple of months. Ted Green, Eleanor Marks, Berglin Karlsdottir, Julian Height, Eric Anderson, Henrik Schoeman, Clive Mayhew, David Lonsdale, Jim Mulholland, Emma Gilmartin, Harry Studholme, Jeremy Barrell, Kristen Mollestadt, Oliver Lundertray, Jim Chambers, Russell Miller, Helena Kyle, and Carrie Brady. Thank you all very, very much. Also, thank you to our sponsors Still. Thank you to all of the association team who work in different capacities to make all this happen, particularly to Andrew for this series, who's been working behind the scenes to make it all happen. And of course, thank you, our wonderful audience. With the audience now, we'll have cleared 8,000 viewers in total across the last 13 webinars. So that's really great. The webinars are going from strength to strength, and we're hugely grateful for you all for joining us. But we're not done quite yet. Dry your tears. It's not over, because tonight we have another fantastic event for you. Levon Bigelow will be speaking about street tree composition and survival in Philadelphia, and Korena Mafune will be telling us about the secret life of old growth treetops and canopy soils. So let's make a start for one more time this season. Levon, over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, John. I appreciate that. Without further ado, let me share my screen. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for having me, everybody. I also want to say it's really cool to see everybody coming from all over the world, from all those different places that I saw in the chat briefly before we got started. So without further ado, my name is Levon Bigelow, and today what I'll be doing is presenting my master's thesis research from when I was at the University of Connecticut. I'm currently a research fellow with the Oak Ridge Institute for Science and Education in collaboration with the U.S. Forest Service. And so my project that I focused on for my master's degree was primarily looking at factors associated with street tree survival in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So to begin, why monitor trees? It's a good question. Why monitor street trees in particular? Well, street trees, given that the trees are planted in the right place and at the right time, can influence human health and well-being. So they can have positive effects on human health and well-being. They provide a slew of ecosystem services that I'm not really going to recap, because I'm sure you may have heard a number of them at this point, but also kind of implicit in what I mentioned with, given that they're planted in the right place, in the right species, and at the right time, there can also be ecosystem good services. That won't be the focus of today's talk. Street trees also represent a significant investment for municipal governments. So a study in 2016 by Howard Peterson revealed that among a large number of urban forestry organizations at the municipal level in the United States, street trees represented the largest allotment of municipal funding within urban forestry budgets. Street trees also fundamentally require human intervention. So street tree populations, urban forest populations, but particular street tree populations, they are controlled by humans. So planting is usually controlled by humans. You don't really see that natural regeneration like you'd see in wildland forest or urban forest patches. And so it's very important for us to monitor trees, because if we want a sustainable and healthy, vigorous population over time, then we need to management in order to achieve that goal. Also, kind of on the converse side, street trees can pose different safety concerns, whether that's to local property or to humans. You know, trees can fail or their limbs can fail, and that can pose different damage. Also, if the wrong trees are planted, or, whatever the instances might be, sidewalks may be uplifted. We might get some interference with above ground or underground utilities and local infrastructure. So we may need to address those concerns that we provide in the local setting. And also, we might want to check and assess changes and trends over time, whether that's relevant to different management objectives that we have or to assess the efficacy of different management strategies. So for managing for a particular outcome, we want to monitor the resource that we're managing to see if the management is having the desired effect. So moving forward, the study site is the city of Philadelphia, which is it's a major city on the east coast of the United States. And it's also known as one of the poorest large cities in the United States due to its relatively high poverty rate of 23.1%, which has interesting implications for equity and equitable distribution of the well-managed resource, the resource in general. So what you can see on the left there is the distribution of our study plots within this study. So there are 103 permanently established plots throughout the city of Philadelphia that were designed to be representative of the city as a whole. So the street trees in the city of Philadelphia generally fall under the jurisdiction of the Philadelphia Parks and Recreation Department. Just so we have more background on the city of Philadelphia, it's a post-industrial city which over the past few decades has experienced a series of budget cuts, in particular to the Parks and Recreation Department, led in a reduction in staff, which has subsequently led in a backlog of management requests for this public resource that can be an asset given that it's managed properly. So that's just some background on how street trees are managed in the city of Philadelphia and some challenges that are associated with that management. And also trees can be planted and stewarded often by local residents and property owners, the Philadelphia Water Department, nonprofit organizations, and business districts. So my objectives for my master's thesis were twofold, and we'll focus mainly on the second objective. But the first objective was to analyze composition, structure, and characteristics of the tree community and potential shifts associated with it. But again, we'll be focusing primarily on the second objective today, which was to assess the factors associated with tree survival and mortality, which are really two sides of the same coin. So for the study design, we followed a longitudinal monitoring design in the field. So it was a field monitoring study, which involved a repeated inventory of all of the trees on our permanently established plots. And so on the right, you can see a blown up version of one of the plots that we had. And we wanted to, so longitudinal monitoring involves returning to the same individuals over time. And so in order to do that, we needed to have precise locating methods. So we used the block edge distance method where we collect distance along curb edges. We also used the address and site code method where we're just collecting the address and site codes for the different trees. And we collected photos to be sure that we're in the same exact future, especially since time points are 6 years apart. So again, there were 103 permanently established plots that we can also now return to in the future to conduct further studies, and each plot was half a mile, which is 0.8 kilometer road segments that were allowed to randomly turn at each intersection. Followed protocols in the Urban Tree Monitoring Field Guide and resource guides, which I highly recommend checking out if you are curious about urban tree monitoring. So here are some examples of trees that are very easy to return to in the future because either the stump is still on the ground or the tree is still standing. And here are some examples of when it's not as easy to return to a tree because perhaps the stump is ground or the pit that used to exist in the past is now a new sidewalk flag, so it's a light or in front of some outdoor seating area at a downtown dining restaurant. So in terms of data collection, there were three categories of data that were collected. There were the field data variables, which include species, trunk diameter, a number of variables that were amalgamated into one variable known as crown vigor, which is roughly crown condition. That's how we can think about it. Also site type and use, crown light exposure to the amount of sides that a tree was exposed to. And also presence or absence of overhead wires. And there were also different species characteristics, including drought tolerance level, expected stature at maturity, so the height of the tree. So that's used cutoffs of 7.6 meters and 15.2 meters, which is 5 feet and 50 feet. And other local site and socioeconomic variables, including percent impervious and a 15-meter buffer around a tree, construction activity, specifically demolition activity, and neighborhood characteristics, including economic measures, educational attainment, demographic variables, and homeowner stability. All have been in some way or another associated with street tree survival in prior research. Here's just a photo of the crew, a number of crews that were a part of this study. They're magnificent. This was during the training week where they're learning to collect different variables for the data. And this is a photo of myself and Dr. Jason Henning, who's with the Forest Service at the Northeast Station and also with AV tree experts. We were doing some AQC on the data collected by the crew members. Again, we'll just briefly skim through objective one. I want to focus specifically on the structure, which involves the size class distribution and potential replacement and numbers in individual size class bins. And so to explain what I mean, we'll take a look at this graph here, which is the size class distribution of the trees in 2015 versus 2021. And so this is paired size class bins where you see the values for 2015 in light blue and the values in 2021 are in dark green. Overall, there was a net decrease of 115 trees between the two time points. Size class bins are 7.6 centimeters in diameter for the first two bins and then 15.2 centimeters in diameter for the rest of them, which is 3 inches. And the first thing that we notice in that third size class bin from the left is that there are significantly more trees in that third size class bin, which reflects in my head establishment and the trees growing into larger size classes. However, what we see in the first two size class bins, which are the small trees and relatively the newly planted trees, that they're not seeing as many numbers of stems in the ground that we saw in 2015. So that might be related to, either a lack of replacement, so we're maybe not planting as many trees as we were in the city of Philadelphia, but would also reflect a lack of survival in those younger trees in those smaller size classes. Here's just another look at those bar plots, which may help to visualize the pattern. That peak in the green, which is the 2021 number, moving to the right, that rightward shift reflecting establishment and growth into larger size classes, and a lack of overlap there on the left, where we're not seeing as many individual stems in those smaller size classes. And so overall for that sub portion of the objective for the structure of the street tree community in Philadelphia, we see that the tree diameter is generally increasing, but we're perhaps lacking in replacement or survival of the younger trees. That's a smooth segue into the second objective, which focuses on the survival and mortality of the individual trees. And so for this objective, I wanted to look at three kind of categories, which included traits and attributes of the different trees at the taxa or tree level, also local site characteristics, which reflect the growing environment for the different trees, and the neighborhood's social context, which involves human-related variables. I wanted to compare the effect sizes in different variables, and we'll kind of understand more what that means along. So, to kind of situate us within the context of tree mortality in the street tree context, and by the way, street trees also includes trees and medians for study, but mortality in this study relates to trees that either died or were removed. So when we think about trees in natural settings like traditional forests or patches, we understand that trees can decline, senesce, and eventually experience failure. That's what we think of generally when we think of mortality of trees. But given that trees in urban forests, their population is controlled by humans, right? So we're planting individual trees. We're not really seeing that natural regeneration. Also, trees can die due to humans removing the trees before they experience the death as we think about it. And as I mentioned earlier, that might be to mitigate perceived safety risks by professionals. Also might be due to preferences and perception. So that might be due to perceived future conflicts with infrastructure or with utilities or perceived health risks. This bullet is more for the residential setting, but it can also be in the street setting. Trees may also be removed or experience mortality events due to construction and development activities, either through being injured directly to the root system or being directly removed. So just to kind of recap, and I want to highlight a couple of variables as I go through the different categories, but for tree traits and attributes, one variable that I want to highlight here is the small tree variable. So I wanted to capture tree size in this study and see the relationship between tree size and mortality. And the way that the data revealed was perhaps an adequate way of incorporating size into the study was to compare small trees, so trees that are less than 7.6 centimeters in diameter, 3 inches, compared to larger trees. And for the local biophysical environment, I believe I've covered all of these, so I won't rehash the recap slash re. And then for the neighborhood social context, there are a number of different variables here. What I wanted to highlight on the right was that the construction activity, we collected these data at the parcel level. So using data from the city of Philadelphia, we've got the parcels and permits for construction activities, specifically demolition, that were attributed to the parcel level. That's really, I think that was a highlight that we wanted to, that was something we wanted to highlight here. Also, we've got a number of different variables that were collected at the census tract level through the U.S. Census Bureau's American Community Survey data, which isn't parcel level. It's more of a coarse variable. And I think that there is still value in incorporating these, even though it might not be the best way to capture the social, economic status and sociodemographic variables around a tree, but it might highlight patterns for future investigation. So without belaboring that point, I wanted to describe it just a little bit. Variables that were considered for this analysis that weren't knocked out due to correlations with other variables, so others were knocked out. Ones that were left are percent of residents that are in poverty, percent of unoccupied housing units, percent of renter-occupied housing units, percent of residents that moved in the last 5 years, and percent of residents with a bachelor's degree or higher. So here what we have is a tree mortality curve, which looks at the mortality of the trees in different size class bins, the same bins that we looked at before. We see that there's a general pattern of trees in the smallest size classes experiencing the highest mortality rate, and then the general decline as the size class increases, and that's known as a type 3 mortality curve, type 3 mortality pattern. And there's an overall annual mortality rate of 3.67% for the trees in the study, which according to an urban tree mortality review conducted and published in 2019, that seems to fall about in the range that we'd expect, which is definitely lower than guesstimates from the past. So moving on to the analysis portion of this study, I followed a iterative multi-logistic regression building process. And so I built a model iteratively. And so this kind of analysis is often used in epidemiological studies and has been used in a number of different pre-survival studies as well. Some are cited down at the bottom there, but it involved looking at a binary outcome. So whether, in the example of epidemiology, whether a human died or didn't, or contracted a disease or didn't. And what this allows us to do is to look at different variables and compare the effect sizes relative to the outcome. And so, without ado, we'll kind of dive in. This is a forest plot. I know there's a lot going on here. We're going to break it down as we go along, but generally what we have here are different levels of different variables and their associations with tree mortality. So you have the individual dots, which represent the odds ratio, so roughly the effect size. And the blue dots and bars are 95% confidence intervals. The blue represents a positive association with tree survival. The gray represents an insignificant association, and the red represents a negative association with tree survival. I've got this broken down into the 3 separate sub-objectives, and we'll talk about it as we go along with associated graphs and photos. Starting with tree traits and attributes, got expected stature at maturity. So if you notice in the forest plot on the left, you see that there's different different variables, levels that are within brackets. So there's expected stature, small and medium. And so what it's doing is it's comparing those other levels to the baseline level, which is quote unquote the worst level. And what that means in context is that trees that are expected to be large in stature in the future experience the highest mortality rate. So on the right side here on this slideshow, you can see that there's a bar graph that is independent from the logistic regression. It's just for visualization purposes, but it has the annual mortality rates for the different levels. And so the higher the bar, higher the mortality rate. And so the lower likelihood of survival. So the reason that trees with large expected stature in the future might be associated with mortality, especially compared to the other size classes, might be due to the limitations that large trees face in the street tree environment. So street tree environment, as we might know, is a soil limited environment. It's also water limited, but in this context, we'll talk about soil limitations, especially with that tree on the left. That tree needed a lot more soil, and if it's not getting the resources that it needs, it's definitely not going to thrive as much as it could. So that might be a factor that would influence decline over time. And if we look on the right, we can see a tree that was topped over there at the top, very likely so that it wouldn't interfere with the overhead primaries, the electric wires at the top. And topping trees, we know, can negatively impact their overall vigor, and I suspect that had something to do with its decline and eventual mortality. So moving on, another pattern that we found, another finding, is that trees with a higher drought tolerance level were more likely to survive, significantly more likely to survive than trees with a lower or medium drought tolerance level. And as I mentioned before, the street tree environment is very often water limited. So this kind of goes hand in hand with thinking about what species are right for the site. This, of course, this should be at the individual case by case level. Generally, we're finding that trees that have higher drought tolerance level are more likely to survive planting patterns. So now we're looking at both ground condition and the variable for tree size. So that variable again was small trees versus large trees. So trees smaller than 7.6 centimeters or 3 inches in diameter, which captures small newly planted trees. What we're seeing, the general pattern for condition is that trees in poorer condition in the initial time point were less likely to survive than trees in better condition in the initial time. And that kind of just makes intuitive sense. But when we compare the two variables, which is what you're seeing on the right, small trees are in orange, larger trees are in green, there's a significant level of the interaction between the two that improved model fit, which stated that in the excellent size class, the excellent condition class, trees that were smaller were less likely to survive than trees that were larger than 7.6 meters in diameter. And that was kind of confusing at first, but when I thought about it, it kind of makes intuitive sense, especially when you think that trees that are planted are typically planted in excellent condition. So the way I understand this is that it reflects the challenge that young trees might face, smaller trees might face in the urban environment compared to larger trees. Here are some examples. All the way on the left, that's a pretty extreme example of a stressor that a young tree might face in the street tree environment. But this was, part of our study in the city of Philadelphia, where the street was so narrow that some of the residents were parking on the sidewalk. A small tree is not going to be resilient to a stressor like that. And when you're looking at the photo in the middle, it's unfortunate, but it does happen. Trees can get vandalized, cut in half. And, one thing you might notice is that tree was very likely in excellent condition initially prior to being vandalized. And all the way on the right, that's a tree that, its form currently might not be the best form that we might imagine. So you can think about it with me. That tree, if you want to plant a tree and you want the trees along a corridor or along a street, especially outside of the Philly Stadium, to be in good condition to increase the aesthetic value of the property, then you'd probably want trees that are in good conditions. That tree might be easy to just cut down and replace. And so small trees can often be thought of and seen as relatively expendable in urban environments. And now for local site character. So looking at site type, we have three different site types that we wanted to compare generally, which is sidewalk cutouts, sidewalk planting strips, and medians, which have in that order increasing likelihood and association with tree survival. I think that this is directly related to the amount of soil available volume that these trees have available to them. So all the way on the left, you see a sidewalk cutout, which in the city of Philadelphia can be quite small. That, I mean, maybe not that cutout specifically, but some of the cutouts in Philadelphia can be as small as 61 by 61 centimeters, which is 24 by 24 inches, which is very small and not enough for, a tree to survive and thrive. Whereas in the center, you see a sidewalk planting strip where at least the trees have that lateral room for growth for them to extend their roots out into and to also leave the water that's infiltrating into the system. And also, all the way on the right, we see a median in Philadelphia. Some of the medians are extremely large, providing a large number or a large amount of soil available for the tree to expand its roots and also for water and other nutrients to infiltrate into the soil. Now for the neighborhood social context, we've got land use. So there were three different levels of land use that we wanted to compare, including commercial and industrial areas versus residential versus slash other spaces, which again have an increasing association with survival of the trees in the study. I think might also have something to do with the soil quality in those areas. So we didn't directly study soil quality in the study, but some of these variables can be somewhat of a measure. So we can see with the tree all the way on the left that that soil doesn't look very great. There seems that there's a lot of soil compaction going on, so maybe some more stressors in that environment. We look to the center with a residential tree, and we see perhaps different landscaping practices going on there. Definitely less soil compaction. And we look all the way on the right, and we can see that in this park slash other space, that soil is much more conducive to growth. And so this perhaps points to maybe ways that we can steward the trees and the environments that these trees are in. Also, there was one finding, if you'll forgive me, that I forgot to include in this slide, but if you see underneath site type, the percent impervious surface, so areas that have higher percentages of impervious surface were more associated with increased survival, likelihood of survival, if you'll forgive me for that. And I think that this is related to the increased droughts, the increased heat stress in a local environment, especially in city environments, which may exacerbate the drought conditions in the street tree environment. So moving forward, apologize for that. Also see that trees that were at parcels that experienced demolition events were less likely to survive than trees that were at parcels that didn't experience demolition events. And as I mentioned before, this might be directly related to the removal of trees during construction events or to damage that trees might experience during construction events. That is a unique finding that I think we're finding a lot more in the past couple of decades, and it paints to a need for us to address that. And finally, for the neighborhood socioeconomic context, again, I just want to reiterate that these were collected at the U.S. Census Bureau census tract levels, and so they're not fine-grained measures, but I think that they display relatively coarse patterns that we can highlight for further analysis. For example, tree survival was negatively associated with percent of residents in poverty. And there are a couple of reasons that this might be the case. I think that one might be a pattern that we have seen in a number of different studies, including in Oakland, California, where neighborhoods that have lower socioeconomic status tend to have conditions that may not be as favorable for trees. So, for example, that might be smaller tree pits. So that's something that we've seen. But also tree survival, in this case, being negatively associated with residents' poverty, that might be associated with an increase in management, so an increase in removing trees that might need to be removed and might have needed to be removed for a while. So it really requires analysis. Also for percent of renter-occupied housing units, that's positively associated with tree survival. And the thing about that variable is that it's got a wide confidence interval, so you have to take it with a grain of salt, take the results with a grain of salt. That might be, and again, this might be a stretch, but might be related to a lack of a sense of ownership or a lack of actual ownership over the trees in front of the house. Maybe they're not housing units, it might be apartments. Maybe they're not calling 311 to have a tree removed or saying that the tree's in poor condition. The trees might be surviving there longer than um, and that might also be the case when it comes to that final variable down at the bottom with percent of unoccupied housing units. And increasing percent of unoccupied housing units is associated with tree survival. And I think that, if we look at a photo like this is a vacant housing unit in the city of Philadelphia. Now imagine if that tree in the front there was in relatively poor condition. The person who would be most likely to call to get that tree removed would be the person who lived in that housing unit. And since no one lived there, that tree might exist and persist in the environment, even though it might be in great condition. But again, all of those require further investigation to reveal the actual pathway going on there. So for the discussion and implications, all trees will die eventually. And where I like to say that, that's part of what makes life beautiful is that it lasts forever. But in order for us to kind of perpetuate these trees, which can be assets, and as I mentioned earlier, can have a positive effect on human health and well-being, we need to find a balance between a number of different things. And of course, this isn't exhaustive, and I'd love to talk about this more after this presentation. If you would like, please reach out to me, but requires a balance of mortality and planting, right? So we need to be catching up to the trees that are dying by replacing and planting more trees and trying to ensure that those younger trees are surviving so that we have that sustained canopy over time. Also considering the services that trees provide, balancing services versus costs. That could be through the lens of ecosystem services versus ecosystem disservices, which is a conversation all on its own. But it could also be comparing the services that trees provide and the costs of proactive management, right, which is the optimal state of management in any urban forest setting. And site compatibility, we really, I think we are collectively moving towards planting the right trees in the right place, thinking about what species require in terms of the requirements like soil volume and water, but also the attributes of the individual trees. And finally, in terms of balance, biophysical environment and the human environment. So the trees have different needs. So that includes, as we've mentioned and talked about already, the needs for the soil and the water and a variety of other aspects that I didn't quite focus on in the talk here, but also the human environment. So we have, there are aspects of the trees that we need to mitigate, that we need to manage, such as mitigating risk and, the utilities that we have in the construction that is going on in different places and the development that would improve our lives as well. But I think that there is a sweet spot that will enable us to continue with the development, but also just sustain the over time. So I've mentioned before as well, improving young tree survival, and perhaps in the event of construction, increasing tree protections and considering things like restitution funds, like I've seen in when I used to work in New York City at their Parks and Recreation Department, and finally to address the capacity limitations of the city of Philadelphia. And so I'll finish by saying, fortunately, the city of Philadelphia has released their tree plan, which is a strategic plan that is really awesome. It involved a lot of the voices and perspectives of residents, like thousands of them, which is really impressive. And they released this early in 2023, like right before I defended my thesis. It was really awesome that a lot of the objectives in that plan aligned with the findings and some of the discussions on the previous slide that I mentioned to you all. So with that, I will say thank you very much for listening. This acknowledgement slide, you can pause in the recording and take a look at that, especially the funding sources. Thank you very much. Here's some works cited if you want to pause it later. And thank you. This is my crew, my wonderful crew members, and my email if you want to read more. Very much.
Thank you so much, Levon. That was brilliant. You did marvelously, my friend, as I told you you would. I watched Levon give similar presentations before, and he's absolutely brilliant. And it's a really interesting project. And a lot of people in the chat basically saying it sounds very familiar to their town or city or region as well. So I'm sure we'll have some Q&As about that afterwards. So thank you very much, Levon. Korena, are you there? He speaks into the void. There you are. Over to you. Welcome.
Wow. Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. Let me just get the screen set up, shared, and the PowerPoint going. Um, well, I am very happy to be here today to present to you some of my research. It was said that these two presentations were pretty different, but I actually think that they were different enough to compare and contrast in an amazing way because that was an urban environment, and I am going to actually take us into more kind of pristine environments where trees do and are able to reach ages of 200, 300 years of age. So, that being said, I am a research scientist at the University of Washington over here in Seattle, so the Pacific Northwest coast in the States. I have been here my entire academic career. I got my undergraduate in restoration ecology and environmental horticulture. I got my master's in soil ecology, and then I got my PhD in fungal ecology. And now I am working on biotechnologies, bacterial fungal interactions, and I also am still working in these forests. So I'm very excited to kind of give you a crash course of a lot of the research we've done out there. The way this presentation will be set up is I'm going to give a little introduction to fungal organisms. I just think it lays a good foundation for the presentation because I'll be using a lot of fungal centric definitions and words. And then we will kind of lay out a bunch of different projects that we've done in this area. I've been doing research in these old growth ecosystems for the last 15 years, and I hope that I get to do research there forever. It's really amazing. So the topic of my discussion today is don't forget to look up and why canopy soils are so important to old growth ecosystem function. And this is just a list of amazing collaborators and people who have made this project possible over time. The list extends, but then that would just be a giant slide of names. So they know who they are. They know that they're integral to this project. So, before we hop into the research, I just want to emphasize how important fungal organisms are. I don't really necessarily look at myself as a tree scientist. I am more of a soil scientist that looks at how different organisms interact with each other to fulfill ecosystem processes. So, whether that's how fungal organisms interact with trees, other types of plants, or other organisms in their environment, and also the collective circle of how all of these things interact together. So, one of the important kind of baselines I like to start out with is that evidence shows that when plants evolved on the terrestrial landscape, so we're talking in the scale of millions and millions of years ago, there is fossil evidence that shows that fungal associations with plant roots, or what earlier evolutionary rooting traits would kind of look like, but it shows that these fungal associations were vital to the establishment of plants on land. And this association, actually, I'm just going to change my pointer to the laser here. So this association of fungi and plant tissues is very consistent in fossil evidence. So when they look back at the fossils, there's always fungal filaments with those early lineages of plants. But what they also saw is that through this evolutionary timeline, so we move out of kind of the mosses, the bryophytes, we go into the ferns, and we're starting to get into seeded plants, then flowering plants. As we go that direction, these fungal associates diverged many times, but what stays consistent is that about 85 to 90% of plants globally form mutualistic relationships with what we call mycorrhizal fungi, which are not the only plant mutualists. We'll talk about that in a second. But basically, this plant fungal association has stayed consistent over these millions and millions of years, and they are very important to how plants survive and also how ecosystems function in general. So, to kind of just break it down into the groups of fungi that are in ecosystems that are really important, this is very much a basic kind of outline. I could give lectures on all of these groups for, an entire semester. but we basically have decomposer fungi. So there's, for example, white rot fungal organisms. These are powerhouses. So decomposers are so important in ecosystem function because they break down organic matter. Specifically, white rot fungi can break down lignin. So lignin is this extremely complex compound, and I always like to shine light on fungal organisms because they are the only organism who have evolved over time to efficiently break down lignin. So you can kind of thank fungal organisms because if it wasn't for them, what would our built environment even look like? You don't want to build things on organic matter. If fungi weren't breaking down organic matter, it would not break down as quick. Some things may never break down fully. We don't know because fungal organisms have always been here. So they are really important in breaking down these large products and returning these nutrients to the ecosystem. There's also brown rot fungi. They can break down cellulose, so some of the byproducts of lignin. There's other decomposer fungi. And what this is really just painting a picture of is how important these diverse groups of organisms are in ecosystem function, not only in forests, but for example, if we go into an urban environment and there's not a lot of soils or the soils are really unhealthy, we might not have as many beneficial interactions that are able to drive the soil health in a beneficial way. So decomposers are important. As we look into this society, I think that pathogens might be brought up more often. I'm not sure, but in arboriculture and arbory, I think that pathogens get a lot of light shed on them because they're always present in ecosystems and they are typically what cause the diseases. So, for example, root rots, heart rots, blights, rusts, those are very common in different types of ecosystems, whether it's a urban park, an old growth forest that had a disturbance, a prairie ecosystem, cropland. And so when we start looking at pathogens, fungal pathogens to be specific, we want to kind of step back and understand, as Levon was, kind of laying out with this tree health, that the health of an ecosystem is a partial determinant of this pathogen establishment. So, for example, fungal pathogens would be more prone to attack a street tree than they would to attack a tree in a healthy, pristine forest. That doesn't mean that when you go into an old growth forest, there's not pathogens. Pathogens are actually a part of ecosystem processes. You will not ever see a healthy old growth forest without some sort of pathogen interaction. So in these healthier old growth ecosystems, pathogens really do influence forest succession. And that's when you'll see a lot of these pathogens kind of acting as decomposers after they're a pathogen. So in old growth ecosystems, a lot of the times trees will grow really old. They will have a pathogen, but they'll be in a healthy ecosystem. Once that tree falls over, for example, from windfall, the pathogen can sometimes just act as a decomposer and then return it to the forest ecosystem. So pathogens in the sense of fungi are, kind of the bad guys. But when you go into the ecosystems that I've conducted research in, they really do influence the trajectory of those forests, and not necessarily in a bad way. So now that we've kind of laid the ground for the importance of decomposers and the importance of pathogens, whether or not it's an importance in the sense of mass die-off or survivability, we can turn to my favorite group of fungal organisms, which are fungal mutualists. And I want to lay kind of just a point down that I'm talking about these organisms as groups, but the diversity within these groups is vast. So I'm not just talking about a couple of species, I'm talking about thousands of species within all of these groups. And based on the conditions of the ecosystem will impact how they interact with that ecosystem. So the same thing stays true when we move into the mutualistic fungi. And we will first mention mycorrhiza, which is that fungal group that associates with about 85% of plants. So mycorrhiza, what it does is it establishes within plant roots, like tiny plant roots. So think of the size of like a pencil tip or a piece of, lead refill for a pencil. These roots are tiny. So the fungal organisms, what they do is they establish structures in the roots. Depending on the type of mycorrhiza you have will reflect what kind of structures it has evolved to establish and also what kind of plant host it has evolved to establish with. So for example, about 80% of plants globally associate with arbuscular mycorrhiza. That includes trees, it includes shrubs, grasses, forbs, a huge diversity of plants. Ectomycorrhiza, on the other hand, only associates with about 5 to 8% of plants globally, but it associates with a lot of tall, woody trees. So in areas like, for example, the Pacific Northwest, or when you get into other old growth forests around the world, you will have, I should say, especially in the temperate climates, you will have a lot of ectomycorrhiza. And ectomycorrhiza are a type of fungi that can fruit mushrooms. So this type of mycorrhiza that associates with about 80% of plants globally never fruits a mushroom above ground. Its reproductive structure is a spore. It stays hidden. It's very cryptic. And we never see it, but it is integral to plant survivability and has been since plants established on land. So I just like to reflect on the things that may be really important in ecosystems are often the things we may not ever see. And then we can get into the other groups and break it down. Again, I could give a lecture on all of these, but just the overall takeaway that there's different types of mycorrhiza. Depending on the plant will depend on the type of mycorrhiza. There's also some plants that can associate with both ectomycorrhiza and arbuscular mycorrhiza. It gets really complicated, which I love. So what the mycorrhiza does when it attaches to the root is it extends a hyphal network out. So for example, hyphae right here. And that can actually branch out really far, and it uptakes nutrients for the plants in exchange for plant sugars. So it is this trade-off where the plant is like, here, have some carbon. And the mycorrhiza is like, thanks, I need that. It's the only way I can survive. Here is some, for example, phosphorus or nitrogen. And if the ecosystem is really unhealthy or something is disturbed, it can really impact these interactions. So then we talked about mycorrhiza, but what has been researched a little more often, and what I'm particularly interested in as well, is other types of plant growth promoting fungal organisms. So for example, there's a lot of root endophytes. So technically mycorrhiza go inside roots, but they are a certain group of mutualism. There's other root endophytes that won't necessarily be categorized as mycorrhiza. For example, these dark septate endophytes that we kind of see wrapping around the roots here, that can, for example, increase resistance for a plant when it's like in drought stress or if there's heavy metal pollution. Mycorrhiza can do that too, but we're just talking about kind of these two different groups of mutualists, again, stacking upon this complexity. There's, for example, leaf endophytes, which can produce the mycotoxins that can reduce certain types of herbivory. There's rhizospheric fungi, so not necessarily fungal organisms that go inside the roots, but fungal organisms that have been categorized to hang out right around the roots. So some of those enzymatic interactions may be benefiting the root, even though they're not directly attached to it. It can get really complicated. And what's really amazing to me about this is research on this is really just starting to take off. Fungal organisms, mushrooms in particular, are very trendy right now. So I think that gives fungal organisms a moment to really shine when they've been buried underground or, for example, up in the trees, to really understand how integral they are to the survivability of our ecosystems. So now that we kind of have that overall backbone of fungal organisms, we can kind of think about how they provide, in a sense, of ecosystem functioning and ecosystem services. So I kind of look at this center line and expand it out to think about what are we missing when we don't consider certain parts of ecosystems? For example, if we don't think about what is above ground in certain forests, are we missing gaps in, for example, nutrient cycles, primary productivity, of course, biodiversity? And those are some of the things I'm going to get into. So the two sites that I have for this research are over here on the coast of Washington State, so the Pacific Northwest coast. I apologize. I realize I should have zoomed out on this map a little bit more. It's usually national or to Canada sometimes. So, you know, that this is the Canadian border right here, just to give you an idea. Seattle is right here. This is the Olympic Peninsula. If you are ever over in Washington and you have the opportunity to go explore these forests, I wholeheartedly would recommend that. They are not like any other areas I've seen in the world, and I've been to quite a few forests. So I have two plots. They are lowland riparian old growth ecosystems. One is in the Hoh rainforest, which is likely the rainforest you would have heard of if you have heard about our temperate rainforests. And then kind of the secret tucked away one, the Queets. So you can see in spatial location, they're pretty linear in where they fall in the sense of the watersheds. Both of these sites have similar species characteristics. So old growth maples, old growth Sitka spruce, big leaf maples to be specific. And then a lot of the understories, for example, sword fern, huckleberry, salmonberry. So a very well structured kind of, as I think, like locked in time forest ecosystem. These trees, the big leaf maples, reach over 200 years old. The Sitka spruce in this area reach well over 350 years old. A lot of them have been tagged to 600 years old. The oldest one out there that they know of right now, I think, is just under 1,000 years old. So the trees live pretty long around here. And so what is pretty focused on the climate in these areas and what allows canopy soils to form, which I'll start describing a little bit more, is that we have a very special climate. If we go back to that peninsula that I just showed, that mountain range really causes a lot of climatic influence with moisture. So these areas have high fog, they have high rainfall. And because these trees grow so long, canopy soils have the opportunity to form. And just to give you perspective in millimeters, because we're around the world and not stuck in a non-metric system, which I could talk about all day. But if I were standing there and all the rain in this forest were to fall at one time, I would be standing in 3,000 to 4,000 millimeters of water. So that is a lot of water. It's about 12 feet for my other US people who are sitting in here. I would be in over 12 feet of water. So a lot of water, not necessarily the wettest place on Earth, but it does get notable mentions when they do make those lists of where's the wettest place on Earth. And so what happens in these very wet, moist areas with these old growth trees is these thick mats of canopy soil form on these branches. They don't just form on the big leaf maples in this ecosystem. They form on other trees as well, but I focus on the big leaf maples because of their branching structure. It allows the mats to kind of get a bit more copious and stacked up. And so what happens is as these trees get older, the bryophytes, so mostly mosses over in this ecosystem, they establish on the tree. But then, of course, these trees grow over decades and centuries, and these mosses have their life cycles, which, they die, regrow, and they start stacking up organic matter. And then on top of that, we have other higher epiphytes, for example, licorice fern, other small plants. I've actually seen about a 5-foot Sitka spruce growing 40 feet above ground in a maple tree. That's not a common occurrence, but it is an occurrence that I have seen. And so as all of these epiphytes establish, not only does their organic matter kind of stack up and break down, but it intercepts the other litter fall in these ecosystems. And what this does is it provides canopy soil. So underneath these living epiphytic mats, there is this canopy soil. And just to give you perspective, I mean, you can already see little me and huge tree. But the branch is about this large right here. So this whole thing it's kind of tricking you to think the branch is huge, but it's really the mat of canopy soil. And so what we really wanted to understand is canopy soils have really only been researched for about 40 years now. When I started about 30 years. So it's a field that's pretty much in its infancy. One, because you have to get access to these pristine areas, which we don't want to harm in the sense of their nature. We want to be ethical about it. So permitting is really important. And then also just climbing trees, as I'm sure more of the people in this audience can relate to me than ever before, is actually pretty tedious in the sense of getting out there, getting structures up there, sampling and all of that. But what really sparked my interest is when we went out there and I started helping sample these canopy soils, I saw these roots under the soil mat. So this is a mat of canopy soil. I've seen canopy soil mats that are deeper than 35 centimeters. They can get pretty deep up there. So I saw these roots and I was with one of my mentors at the time and I was like, there's no large trees up here. Like, what are these roots? They're not, rhizomes or rhizoids from the bryophytes or the ferns. Like, these are large roots. And she said, oh, they're adventitious roots from the tree. And I was like, wait, what? So this tree is growing adventitious roots off of its branch into these organic soils. Organic soils are usually really tasty. They have a lot more nutrients than, for example, mineral soils. So I was like, whoa, there's roots growing out here. And that's when I was becoming, a young fungal enthusiast. So I was like, what do we know about the root associated communities? What do we know about the plant available nutrients? Well, the answer to my question were really nothing. We don't know a lot. We know that there has been evidence that they're associating with fungi, but that's kind of where it stopped. And there's just so many things to still discover. And the one thing that really drove me into this was I was thinking about forest management, right? Climate change, old growth forest resiliency. And it kind of dawned on me that if we're ignoring the processes that are happening in these obviously extensive mats of canopy soil in this ecosystem, what are we missing when we look at these old growth forests and their survivability? Maybe the canopy soil compartment is something that has actually provided them kind of like this protective blanket in the face of a changing climate. So we wanted to look at the root associated fungal communities. We wanted to look at nitrogen and phosphorus dynamics. So how much nitrogen and phosphorus are available on the canopy compared to the forest floor. We also wanted to understand some carbon dynamics, for example, in greenhouse gas emissions and how that could plug into, for example, modeling scenarios in this system. We also more recently have looked at other biodiversity measures to overall just really understand how canopy soils influence ecosystem function. So I will run you through the results. I'm not going to go too much into methodology. If anybody is interested in the methodology, please feel free to ask me in an email. It can get pretty lengthy in time if we go into all of the methods. So what we wanted to do first was we wanted to look at fungal establishment in the canopy roots and the forest floor roots. So we collected 1,200 roots, we cleared them of their tannins, and then we stained the fungal organisms. These are using a mix of microscopy techniques, but overall, these are the fungal organisms established in the root. We can see that there's fungi in different layers of the cell. These all are overlapped with what you would see for mycorrhiza. So this is an arbuscular mycorrhizal associated tree, and these are arbuscular mycorrhiza structures. I had hypothesized that there wouldn't be as much fungal establishment in the canopy, and why this is important because it kind of gives you insights on the amount of exchange that may be going on in the plant or the amount of energy that is being put into maintain these relationships. For example, if there's not as much mycorrhiza in a certain type of rooting system, you can kind of get inferences to predict that they may not be benefiting that plant as much. But when we looked at a comparison between big leaf maple roots at the floor level and the canopy level, I thought that the canopy would have a lot less establishment, for example, because dispersal limitation, but we actually found that there was no significant difference, neither between the hoe and the queet site or between the canopy and the forest floor environment, which was amazing to me. So that's like, there's as much fungi in the canopy roots as there is in the forest floor roots. What kind of fungi are there? Do they shift under different climate change scenarios? And what does that mean for this host tree health? And so that's when we went into sequence and understand what fungal communities were associating not only with the old growth maple roots on the floor, because nobody had ever looked at that before, but also what was associating with the canopy roots. And so what this is this is a PCOA plot. It's supported by other statistical tests, but what it basically shows you is relationships in space. So this, for example, is an entire fungal community condensed into a distance point. So it's not just one fungal organism. This, if I look back at the data, would probably be about 300 different fungal organisms associating with one maple. And this is another maple, this is another maple, and so on. So these are all communities associating with the maples that I sampled. And what we can see is very beautiful in ordination space that there is a clear divide between the forest floor community and then also the canopy community. But then to add a different layer to that, there was also a pretty clear divide between the two different canopy ecosystems in the hoe and the queets, but not between the forest floor, again, which stacks up on that dispersal limitation. So we went a step further. And so after just comparing it at the floor level and at the canopy level, we went to the canopy level and I put in these drought structures because we are really interested in how these canopy soils may be threatened as these forests experience wetter winters and drier summers. So I actually set up structures 80 feet above the ground. It was a grand time. which diverted half the rainfall and then also doubled the amount of rainfall and then the ambient conditions. And what we wanted to know is, do we see different communities associating with these roots at different points in time? Because if we rewind, I mentioned that there can be fungal organisms that help trees with drought, for example. There can be fungal organisms that, can appear and be detrimental to the tree during certain seasons because of stress. We just really wanted to understand that. And so this one is not as clear as the last one. I was a little sad about that, but it's still supported statistically by a test called Permanova, which shows that they are significantly different, even though they're clustered a little more sparsely. But what we saw across these treatments was that in canopy soil environments, root-associated fungal community composition was not only dependent on the type of rainfall treatment, but it also changed on spatial location, and it shifted during the seasonal sampling period. So we were out there sampling these roots for an entire year in spring, summer, fall, and then spring again. Winter was too dangerous to climb that year, unfortunately. So through this study, we found a lot of species of interest. So, for example, we found a group of fungi that's widely considered to be a decomposer, but there's been recent studies coming out that's showing that it actually can be mutualistic to a plant, and it was one of the most abundant species associating with our maple roots. So further functional studies are really needed to understand what it might be doing up there, because it might be doing something really significant. We don't know. We know it's there, though. We found a lot of those dark septate endophytes, and some of them are dark septate endophytes that have been proven for other plants to benefit plants, for example, in times of drought, specifically this Cryptosporiopsis that we found a lot. Same thing for these other species. These are all facultative species that could be beneficial, that were up there in notable abundance. And overall, we had our Bigelow mycorrhiza up there, which is an obligate mutualism. So there's really no question that there's a nutrient exchange going on between the plant roots and the fungal organisms. And so that was just a really cool takeaway, that we had a different diversity in the canopy and the forest floor. In the canopy, it was a little more prone to shifting over these functional seasons. So it's really kind of laying this foundation that fungal organisms and canopy soils may be pretty important in these old growth forests. We took it a step further to look at nitrogen and phosphorus availability. So we looked at mineralization, so the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus that's being made available in canopy and forest floors. The opposite would be immobile. So for example, if there's a mobilization, there's no available nitrogen on the forest floor, there's really high competition. And so what we actually found was that canopy soils mineralize a lot more phosphorus and nitrogen than forest floor soils on a per mass basis. And that wasn't too much of a surprise, because these are organic soils and not mineral soils like on the forest floor. So the fact that they were organic means that they usually have a lot more organic matter that's breaking down and providing nutrients. But if we were holding a kilogram of canopy soil and a kilogram of forest floor soil, there is a lot more nutrients typically in the canopy soil available for those roots and fungi than there is in the forest floor. And there were some anomalies, especially in these later seasons. Fall 2018 and 2019 was when we wrapped this particular study. Of course, there's variability because it's a forest. There's always going to be variability. But what we found was that a lot of the times when there was no nitrogen or phosphorus available at the forest floor level, there was some available in the canopy level, which can be tapped into by these host trees. We did the same project for the drought and the rainfall. We also found that these structures and seasonality impacted these mineralization rates, which was not really a surprise, but it was staying consistent that these wetter and drier conditions do impact the amount of nutrients that are available at the canopy level. And the fact that sometimes there's not nutrients available on the forest floor, it becomes really important to think about when we think about managing these ecosystems and what canopy soils mean for the survivability of these trees. We converted this to a forest level basis. So I've been talking about a host tree basis. When we correct for canopy soils of big leaf maple at a hectare basis, we found that they are enhancing the annual nitrate pools by 5.2%, the ammonium pools by almost 50%, which is pretty significant. And overall, the net nitrogen by 8.7%. and then phosphate by 3.7%. And so those numbers, some of them are small, but the fact that at an ecosystem scale, they are enhancing the nutrient pools. And this is just big leaf maple. Sitka spruce harbors a lot more canopy soil and has a higher basal area in these stands. So if we were to incorporate spruce into this, those numbers I would hypothesize would just get a lot larger. So we're ignoring a lot when we don't think about canopy soils where they do prevail. They also, for example, when there's a heavy rainfall event, they leach these nutrients to the floor. Especially they leach a lot of carbon, but these other nutrients that we looked at, for example, nitrates, ammonium, phosphates, those also leach to the floor. So even though canopies are kind of this separated ecosystem, they are looped in directly to these nutrient cycles in these forests. So then we look over to canopy soils being considered in the greenhouse gas cycle, because we are just trying to build the story of not ignoring canopy soils, because a lot of people try to, say they don't matter too much. This is a colleague and friend of mine, Lizzie Stone. She's amazing. She helped with this study and kind of led this end of the work. But we found that the canopy soils of just big leaf maple contribute about 4% to stand level CO2 emissions and contribute to about 4% of the methane sink. Methane is more potent than CO2. But the methane sink was dependent on soil depth. So the deeper these canopy soils get, the more they seem to kind of sequester that methane, which might do with the microbial processes. We don't know. We need more researchers to go out there and be canopy soil advocates. So overall, what we have found out is that there is a diverse, significantly functional microbial community clearly dwelling in the canopy soils, but these interactions we don't know too much about. Some of the work that is hot off the press, so you're some of the first people to hear about this, is that with the collaboration that I did recently with the team at Western Virginia University, we actually found that soil respiration was higher in the canopy soils than on the ground. Again, this makes sense. Respiration is decomposition into CO2, to put it very simply. But that makes sense because there is very active microorganisms up there, and it's organic matter. So if you were looking at that, most people who work with soils and respiration would have hypothesized that. We also found that nematodes were more abundant in canopy soils, and the people who are working with this nematode diversity, I am not a nematodologist, but the people who are were actually really excited. Apparently, they're finding some extremely rare nematodes up there, and they're finding more, for example, bacteriivores and fungivores. So nematodes that, for example, prey on the fungi and help the decomposition cycle, not necessarily pathogenic nematodes, which were also found, but a little more on the forest floor level. I looked at fungal root associates directly. This is the soil. So I mentioned earlier that there's rhizosphere, there's bulk soil, there's root. Fungal communities and bacterial communities can be different in all those levels. So this was looking at just canopy soils and not roots. And what we actually found was that bacterial and fungal diversity was highest on the ground and decrease with branch height, which we would expect because of those dispersal limitations. Not as many things can get into the canopy. But what we also found was that the soil communities were still more active in the canopy than they were on the ground. So there can be a lot of functional redundancy when there's a lot of diversity. So even though you have a high diversity, they may not be as functionally beneficial as a smaller diversity that has like a really tight niche of functionality. So canopy soils actually had more active beneficial communities than the forest floor, collectively from all our research. The nematodes, microvores in particular, were more abundant in the canopy, which stacks on to these cycles that are going on up there. And the increased community activity and more trophic interactions, they're hypothesizing that this is happening because there's more interaction between nematodes, bacteria, and fungi in the canopy. And we also are seeing a lot more soil nitrogen in the canopy, which we're trying to link some of the drivers to that. So overall, canopy soils should not be overlooked or underlooked because they're above your head, because adventitious roots were associating with a unique suite of fungi, including mutualists, so they are getting nutrients from these canopy soils. which are acting as a nutrient reserve for the host tree, and not only the host tree, but the epiphytic diversity. A lot of the studies you'll see in canopy soil environments focus on the epiphytes. This one takes it to a different level of focusing on the host tree and then forest level function. Which there we go. They contribute to forest level nutrient dynamics. And overall, I really have this, which is beginning to be a strong theory based on evidence, that they may be a resilience compartment for these old growth trees, especially in a changing climate. I do not see big leaf maples grow this old anywhere else. If you have, please let me know. But maybe I hypothesize that these maples can establish and live so long in these old growth forests because of the canopy soil compartment. There's a lot of things to still be sifted out, but overall, I don't have any doubt that canopy soils are important to these ecosystems. Everything I told you is just for big leaf maple. So just imagine what we would think if we start looking at Sitka spruce, which can harbor larger biomass of canopy soil. We found a wide array of mushroom diversity up there, and we're still teasing through that. Some of them are species that are not defined. There's so many people who have put time into this research. I could spend another, 40 minutes going over that. Also, thanks for bearing with me because I know I'm a little over. And that being said, this is my collaborator, Dr. Jen Kane. This is me, both of us in trees, where we are in our happy place. I am happy to answer questions as we open up that part of the webinar.
That was awesome. Thank you so much. So interesting. Wow. Both of you fantastic. Thank you so much, Korena. Levon, would you like to come back, sir? Awesome. You'll see later on when you look through the chat, everybody was loving both of your talks. You can see them with all their little cartoon things that they like to press because they're children, basically. I have put in the chat just now, but we'll only have time to work through a few questions, but that's fine. We'll send them all to our speakers afterwards. So we will jump around for a little bit, and we will go back to Levon for a minute. Peter's asked about the fact that in the UK, urban trees have an average lifespan of about 20 years. We sometimes hear it's about 13 years, but up to about 20 years. Is this a similar situation in Philadelphia that you found?
So we didn't have the ability to look at the lifespan of these trees. So we didn't conduct, for example, like a cohort monitoring study where we know how old each of the trees are. We don't have access to those kind of records. At least I didn't in my study. So I will say, no, I don't know off the top of my head, but I do know that it's likely closer to that number of 20 than it is to the 13 figure that we previously heard.
Yeah.
I don't know for sure, but I think it's definitely longer than 13 years.
It's a pretty grim picture, I think, all over the world, really. So we all need to work on that. Okay, thank you very much. Right, we will leap now into the canopy. I'm going to confuse myself trying to jump between these questions. There were a couple of questions, Korena, about, and you kind of maybe slightly addressed this towards the end, but there was a couple of questions, one from Lindsay, about is there a negative impact from canopy soils on the bark and longevity of the host trees? And then someone else Paul asked how the cambial layer copes with aerial soils. So the focus of those questions really was, does it cause damage? But then at the end there, you've said you think actually there might be a protective resilience aspect to it. What's your take on the potential for damage?
Yeah, so I'll start off with the damage. So these canopy soils, they can be huge mats. So they're like a giant sponge when they're dry. They do not weigh too much. When it's wet out, they have a lot of pore space. They suck up a lot of water. They can get extremely heavy. These trees are very strong in the sense of being able to uphold that heaviness, but inherently with the old growth ecosystem, we do see branches fall off with canopy soil mats, which can damage the tree, of course. Although I look at that as a benefit because part of old growth forest structure is nursery logs and stuff like that, for example. So when a canopy branch falls, it just becomes part of the forest ecosystem, provides nursery logs in the sense of what we see directly under the canopy soil. I have dug to a bottom of a mat and the bark on the tree seems not damaged at all. There's not, any sign of extra, fungal pathogen structures kind of fruiting underneath where there's that more moist area. The bark doesn't really look like it's been deteriorated or, kind of worn down or anything by the soil mats. The bryophytes do kind of connect around the tree, and so do the licorice ferns, kind of in those little nooks of the maple bark, because maple bark is very grooved. But there's been studies like early on, people thought that the licorice fern were harming the trees, and then they found that they were just, a commensalism of having a habitat and not hurting the tree. I would hypothesize that canopy soils are the same thing, where it's like, although they do add more weight to the tree and sometimes a tree branch drops, I don't necessarily see it, in my experience, being more common in these ecosystems. Like I'll see poplar trees drop branches more, of course, in like suburban environments than I see maple dropping canopy soil branches in old growth environments. So I do not hypothesize that they cause a detriment. Those are always questions to be asked and further explored.
Brilliant. I'll follow up with a question on that if you don't mind, because Paul's asked, what could we do to encourage more canopy soil habitat? So if we're kind of agreeing it's a good thing and it's a thing we want to have, is there anything we can do to actively encourage the creation of those habitats?
Yeah, so as somebody who also works in the biotechnology field of trying to harness beneficial interactions to do good things for the environment, I think that there could be ways to kind of coax and establish these canopy environments. For example, in greenhouses where they kind of build like a vertical, tree garden in the natural habitat. I do feel like there could be practices that try to influence canopy soil establishment, but these are old growth forests. They have so much succession that goes into making their structure that it's almost one of those things that it's like it's a beautiful thing where it occurs. But where they do occur, they occur there for a reason because of the climate. And so these are forests, for example, canopy soils occur in the temperate forest of Chile. I've climbed in the Amazon rainforest of Peru. They're there. The cloud forest of Costa Rica is where most of the research has been done. New Zealand. So they are globally widespread, but they are specific to the ecosystems that have the climate to influence them. So you could go and, put, moss spawn on a tree somewhere. But it's really the full ecosystem interaction and the climatic influence that allows something so beautiful, I guess, to establish. So I guess I don't have a good answer for that. I've had questions like that, and we've also talked about seeing how long it takes something to establish to that depth or that thickness. So we hope to answer some of those questions in the future.
Brilliant, thank you. If nothing else, your answer made a lot of people very jealous about all the amazing places you've been and stuff you've seen. So that's good. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Okay, Levon, where was I going to ask? I saw a question. I've lost it now because I'm really bad at this, even though I've done 82 and I should know what I'm doing by now. But anyway, the question I was going to ask, which I have also lost. Right, Steve has asked if all of the different organisations planting street trees in Philadelphia follow the same sort of planting specification. We get that problem in the UK sometimes, like when I worked in London for quite a while. You can have lots of different stakeholders, lots of different landowners, all doing their own thing without any sort of overarching unifying system. Is that happening in Philadelphia, or is there some kind of consistency to how the street trees are going in?
So I want to say that there isn't, when you look at the city level, I don't believe that there's a current location for how trees should be planted and, the amount of soil that a different tree should, have for the planting. And that is actually one of the recommendations in the Philly tree plan. So I did see something in the chat. Someone asked if it was in the urban forest master plan. No, the Philly tree plan is this strategic plan that includes goals and recommendations for the city in order to improve the management of the trees in their environment and the relations with the residents in the community there. There is a recommendation for there to be a set of specifications that the city has out for tree plantings and planting after development and things of that nature. I would imagine, though, that within different organizations that are planting trees, like tree tenders in Philadelphia, that they have a set of standards that they follow, and I'm not sure the level of the amount that the different organizations are talking to one another and sharing the same specifications. I don't imagine that they're all using one, but that is a good question.
And sort of following on from that a bit, I'll ask you another question, Levon, as well, from Helen, who's asking about community consultation. Do you know many of the groups planting trees? Do they just go in there and chuck the trees in, or are they working with the local communities to work with them in that tree planting?
That's another great question. So I think in the past, it was more along the lines of we're going to plant wherever we can. I think that's definitely an aspect that's challenging because when you want to increase the canopy in a city or a community or a neighborhood, you want to try to plant wherever you can. But I think recently, places like the city of Philadelphia, when they're including these recommendations to incorporate more of the voices and the perspectives and the desires of the local residents in the local community. I think we're moving towards a place of, do you want a tree? And if not, and we won't plant a tree there. And I know that there was a study conducted by Liz Reedman and her colleagues, looked at North Philadelphia residents and kind of looking at why residents didn't want trees. So there is definitely a respect there these days for if they're submitting no tree requests for where city or other planting organizations might want. So I think we're moving in that direction. Not we, because I don't work for the city of Philadelphia. I think the collective we is, we're trying to honor the desires of the people in areas. And I think one way to improve the number of trees that go in the ground, especially where we can plant trees, is to improve the relationship. A lot of reasons why people have cited why they don't want trees, especially if they're free trees that are coming from the city. Also, this is found in Detroit. I think Michael and just due to a lack of trust and a lack of current maintenance that's taking place. So in different areas where residents aren't planting new trees, I think there needs to be an improvement with the relationship between the community and the planting organizations like the city, and also like catching up on the maintenance requirements I had mentioned earlier. Philly's got this backlog, so improving the relation, extending that line of communication, including the community and involving them in the planning practice and gaining their support, but also important. They're going to be nuisance. We're moving in that direction.
No, brilliant. Thank you very much, Levon. Definitely. I think, again, it's something we're trying to do, I think, a bit more in the UK now, sort of doing planting with people rather than to people, I suppose. Where are we now? Oh, we might have time for one or two more questions. A question for you, Korena, from Mirko, who's talking about air spading or air spades, air knives, air tilling, and the fact that that tool is quite commonly used now to address soil compaction. Injecting, I know you know what this is, but injecting compressed air for everyone out there into the soil to break it up. And Mirko's asking, with your knowledge of how sort of mycorrhiza and fungi work, is there a risk that this compressed air is actually going to damage those fungal associations, and should we be avoiding using air spading when managing veteran trees?
Yeah, so I can answer that from kind of two different perspectives. The first perspective would be that they have found similar things to different techniques. So, for example, tilling agricultural land harms the fungal community. They've seen that, tilling soil and stuff like that is detrimental. Being quite a different technique, but kind of, having a backbone of loosening compacted soil, mixing things up a little bit more. I would say that it does have a detriment. I don't know how much it would because, so for example, how mycorrhiza works is it attaches to the plant root and expands out. So if you are trying to loosen compacted soil, it will also break those hypofragments that are stretching within the soil ecosystem. These hypofragments are tiny, but if you collected them all, they would stretch a extreme amount of length, and they would make up, anywhere from usually 50 to 60% of the biomass in a healthy ecosystem that has a lot of fungi. Compacted soils are probably not going to have like urban compacted soils, in a street pocket will have fungal diversity. They may already have been disturbed to the point where they've selected for a fungal community that may not be as beneficial or healthy. You would have to check for that. I'm going on a tangent now because I'm a fungal nerd, but overall, I would say that yes, it's breaking up the hyphal fragments. That doesn't necessarily remove the fungus from the plant roots, but if a fungus grew out, say 10 feet or put that in meters, sorry. If they grew out, several meters away from the base of the tree and we're tapping into, say, somebody's, fertilized garden space kind of under the sidewalk or something like that, if they could get there, then when you go into shake up that soil and mix it more, you would cut or sever that interaction. So the fungus would still be in the root. And at that point in time, it would be a complexity of, is the fungus now going to die off or is it going to start re-expanding? But there's a lot of layers that can be packed into contemplating the extent of detriment that has.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. I feel really bad because there's loads of really good questions and we haven't got time to do any. So I think we're going to wrap it up. But I've got a feeling maybe we should invite both of you back at some point next series or something to talk. I feel like you've both got lots more to say. So I think we should get you both back on. We have got one final question. I'm going to go to Levon with this question first, and then we'll see if Korena's had time to think of something. But no pressure if you haven't. So let's say, Levon, what is your favourite tree-related book?
I always get the question, what's my favorite tree? And that one's a hard question to answer because it changes often. But my favorite tree-related book, I haven't really read many. Honestly, I haven't read many books. I think we talked about this earlier before the presentation started, where more of the information I read about trees, like Korena mentioned, work, research articles and stuff. But one of the few books that I did read was Urban Forests by Jill Jones. This book talks about the history of urban forestry, and it focuses on the United States. So, and it's a little biased there, pardon me. I know this is an international audience, but if you're interested in the history of urban forestry in the United States, I thought this was a very informative book. Really good one. I'd recommend that. Also,
Brilliant.
my audio seems to be a little fragmenty in and out. I apologize if that's the case. I've seen in the chat a little bit.
It's a little bit in and out, but it's not too bad. It's absolutely fine. Don't worry about it. We've
All
lost
right.
nothing in the translation of the audio. Don't panic. Okay, so I think you've had enough time now, Karina, so we're going to go for it. What is your favourite tree or fungi or soil or anything related thing, let's say? Go.
Yeah, I actually am going to take this as an opportunity to also say one of the reasons that I sometimes steer away from tree-centric books. But as a scientist, I read so many amazing papers all day for work, and I really enjoy it. But what that leads to is I don't typically read leisurely. So I was joking, saying like, I don't know if I really have a favorite book that is a leisure read. I have grown up being a large fan of Kurt Vonnegut's writing in general, but that's not very tree centric. There is a book that I might be biased about because I know the author, and they're an amazing artist. And so it's Giants of the Pacific Northwest Coast, written by Bob Van Pelt. He is a large tree scientist, and that book highlights some of the biggest, like baddest, beautiful large trees along the coast, from the redwoods up to the forests that I've worked in. I'm also very much a fan of fungal identification books. So any books that allow you to get out and identify different types of mushrooms and kind of educate yourself on that. They'd be very tiered to different areas. So like over here, mushrooms of the Pacific Northwest is one of my go-tos. And that being said, I will also plug that sometimes books get ahead of the science. And when they are more kind of autobiographies and things like that, people translate how things have been for them and what they mean to them, which in the sense of storytelling is very important and beautiful. But also sometimes the science basis gets a little extrapolated. So, for example, when you're reading books and things like that, and you get really excited about something, if it's not an article, don't get me into articles. Sometimes those can be a little skewed too. But if it's like a book written by a scientist, but it's more of an autobiography, sometimes the science in that can be a little ahead of its time. So, one of the things that people are getting really excited about right now, which is good because it gets people excited about fungi and trees, is that, for example, trees talk to each other through the mycorrhizal network. Um, we don't know if that's happening. We don't know. It's been kind of looked at in different factors in smaller settings, but it's kind of ahead of the evidence. And it's kind of one of those hard things that gets people really excited, which we need. We need people to get excited. But then it's also like, it's kind of extrapolating the scientific evidence that we have right now. So there is a lot of good in books like that, but there's also some things that can get our perspective on science a little skewed or just a little ahead of what we have in evidence. So yeah.
Well, never let the truth get in the way of a good story, as they say. So that's the message of all literature. Brilliant. Thank you both so much. Obviously, if anyone likes books about fungi and trees, and of course, this one here by David Humphreys and Christopher Wright, published by the Arboricultural Association. Ha ha! Never miss the opportunity to have a little plug. Right. Korena, Levon, thank you so much. That was two absolutely brilliant talks. Everybody loved it. I think you're both wonderful, and I look forward to inviting you back at some point. So thank you both. Thank you to all of our speakers, all series. Thank you to Still, of course, our sponsors. Thank you to all you wonderful people out there for watching us. We will miss you over the next few months. I think we're going to have to do some before November, but we'll figure something out, and we will see you all soon. So take care, look after yourselves, and thank you very much, everybody. Good night.